that's something that I could have difficulty with. I was happy to be flying medevac.
Okay. All right. Were you able to see any of American media while you were in Europe about the war?
Oh, yeah. I had very interesting discussions there. We lived for a while on the economy in a German, rented an apartment from a German family, and had a few German friends off the base. And one of the things I recall quite distinctly, and this was not early on when the issue was Vietnam, this was when before we left Germany, 1974, and to come back to this country. President Nixon was in significant hot water over the Watergate, and Germans and Europeans in general found it very difficult to understand what America was doing this way. That they felt these are things that's not a problem. They were more willing to put up with some of these things that Americans found to be corruption and unreasonably against the law. What are you doing? Was a question that we would field from Germans. I certainly, and I know the big questions about Vietnam. We got the Stars and Stripes every day, but I also bought the Herald Trib, which is a great newspaper. It's at the time it was co-owned by the New York Times and the Washington Post, published in Paris. It's now published all over the world, and you can get it regularly. It's published in Singapore. It's published in Osaka, I think, in Japan. It's published several places in Europe. But at the time, it was published just in Paris. But I always read the Trib every day. And that gave it gave a little more stuff on America. Certainly not as much as the New York Times or the Washington Post. I've read the New York Times for most of my life. We also got Armed Forces Radio Television Network, mostly radio. I rarely watch TV. So I had a sense for it. Of course, I'd be home on leave about once a year for a week or two. What about the American?
Do you feel like, I guess you weren't in the actual fighting, but do you feel like people were critical?
Yeah, I know there's always the bit about soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines coming back from the Far East and feeling insulted. I think the bigger thing was that people weren't asked what they'd done. When my father's generation came back from World War II, there were parades all the time. There were parades on Memorial Day, July 4th, Veterans Day, Labor Day. You'd always follow the parade up to the Memorial Day and Veterans Day anyway, and possibly July 4th. You'd follow the parade up to the cemetery, and there'd be a salute fired off to the fallen. Groups of veterans and groups of active duty personnel marching in the parades. When my generation came back, because people by that time were not happy with the war, I don't think they took it out on people so much as they ignored them. They didn't want to ask because they didn't want to hear the answers. Where were you? What have you done? So I'm certain that there were worse things than that, and I am also certain that there were places where people came home and they were greeted warmly. But I think the biggest thing was the contrast between how these two generations of fighting men were greeted on their return home. No, I was, by the time I returned, I had my master's degree in international relations. I'd applied for a job in the State Department. I'd taken a test for the State Department, passed it, got an interview, decided that We expected to be living in Europe or overseas for much of a career. And so we moved back to Vermont. My wife grew up on a Guernsey farm here in the Northeast Kingdom, in Greensboro. And we got a couple of acres from the farm, and borrowed a tractor, bought a chainsaw, cut some logs, hauled them to the mill, had them sawed into boards, put them up in the calf barn, and a couple of years later built a house. What could I do while we were building a house to support myself and my family? I could get a job teaching, so I got a job teaching, expecting fully to be out of here in a couple of years, and we stayed. This is a great place to raise children, great place to work. Education is supported in rural America. When you're a teacher, you have some status here. I could get paid a lot more to teach in a more urban area, but there would be plenty of teachers there would be plenty of people with higher incomes. Teachers are among the best paid people in rural America, and they have some status. I've appreciated the chance to have an impact here. So, I don't know, I probably got a little far afield.
Do you think that your experience in the Air Force has helped you out a lot with the types of teaching you do now?
Actually, I think any experience helps. When somebody goes into teaching right out of college, and I did that, sure, there's all sorts of fresh knowledge there, but there isn't a lot of the experience that also informs a life. And I think the fact of living a few years, doing a variety of things, and it can be anything. Among the best things I did when I got a job teaching was when we moved back here to make a little more money, because as a young teacher I was not paid much. I bought a rubbish business, and I collected rubbish in the summers, and that meant I was at the dump. I got to see people whose kids I taught. Well, he can't be too bad, he does real work, and I felt that was useful. Mm-hmm. This was still a very good place to live and work.
Do you have any children in the armed forces?
Yeah, both of our sons. Our older son Chase is a major in the Army. He had an extended tour in Iraq, patrolling the airport road into Baghdad. As a company commander. He's now working at the Pentagon in plans, and he'll be going to Johns Hopkins for his master's degree in international public policy starting this fall. Our younger son is a Green Beret. He's had 2 tours in Iraq. Got a Purple Heart on his first tour. He's currently juggling whether he'll be getting out of the service. I expect he won't. One of the jobs that's been dangled in front of him is to go teach combat diving to Navy SEALs out in San Diego, and it sounds like that's what he's going to be doing. He's very focused, very determined, and we're very proud of both of them.
Nice. Is there anything else that you feel like we haven't talked about that you think is important?
I think one of the best things that ever happened to me was being drafted and serving in the military. I've for quite a while felt very good that we have an all-volunteer force, that our military is all volunteer. When I went in there, I was a draftee, though I'd enlisted to avoid the draft into the Army. When President Nixon got the Congress to raise, to get rid of the draft, they had to raise the pay significantly to do that. The problem with an all-volunteer force is that we increasingly have 2 distinct and separate societies, cultures in this country. We have a warrior class that fights and protects the country and does what it's asked to do. And we have the rest of us. For the first time in history, we're fighting a war now in Iraq where we've actually cut taxes since we went in there. We've never cut taxes during the war. instead of asking for shared sacrifice, we've been trying to find ways to give back money to some small portions of this culture. We've been paying some others pretty well to go and fight for us. More disturbing is that we're significantly privatizing core functions of the military. Excuse me a minute.
Sure.
By the time Donald Rumsfeld resigned as Secretary of Defense, a little over a year ago, we had more than 100,000 contractors working for the U.S. military in Iraq. We had just over 100,000 in the armed services in Iraq. Blackwater and DynCorp and the whole slew of companies that are servicing the military have protection in two ways. For one thing, they have not had to, did not for the first while there, have to comply with the UCMJ, and they then got protection by having Paul Bremer sign an order saying that they were not subject to suits in civil courts for things that happened there. So for a while I was saying, okay, if we have a real war, this country needs to put in a draft so that we get everybody in the service. Not a draft like in Vietnam where I could have gotten out of it. People who went to good colleges did get out of the service. Mm-hmm. Dick Cheney didn't have to serve. The president served in a unit of the Texas National Guard that was filled with sons of people who were connected. You could get out of it in a variety of ways if you had the connections, if you had money. We were drafting people who didn't have those advantages. We needed a draft, I felt, more like in the Second World War, where it got people from the fields of the Midwest and from the college campuses in Cambridge and Chicago. Well, I may be changing that. I had a good discussion with my class at Johnson State College the other night, and a couple of the students said, yeah, but wait a minute. Would you like to go to war with people who've been drafted and told they had to go to war next to you? I'd prefer to have somebody, if I'm in a firefight, I'd prefer to have somebody next to me who was there and knew why. So I'm not sure. I'm ambivalent about that. But I'm pretty certain that we're doing this one wrong. Really wrong. For one thing, like Vietnam, I don't think it's our business. Mm-hmm. But I'm more concerned about the lack of transparency in Washington, D.C. I think they've made some terrible errors in this. I think it's perfectly fine to get rid of Saddam Hussein. But I think that's about as far as I can go in supporting what's been done, because the way we've done it and the things we've done attendant with it haven't made any sense.
Okay.
That it?
I think so.
Great. Thanks,
Thank
Josh.
you so much.
No
Really
problem.
appreciate it.
No problem.